Well, hello, and welcome to today's stream. You're watching the Building SaaS with Python and Django stream, and I am your streamer, Matt Lehman. I'm a software engineer, longtime Python developer, and I do web applications for a living and for a hobby. So the purpose of the stream is to teach you about SaaS apps, software as a service apps, and get something done at the same time on my hobby. Two birds, one stone. Excellent. So what are we building? Let's take a look. The software as a service that I work on is called College Conductor. It is a service that is intended for college admissions counselors and helps with students to manage their admissions deadlines and their lists and that sort of stuff. This domain of college admissions is not really what this stream is about. I'm happy to answer any questions about it, of course, but the goal is to show you how to build the technology behind a software as a service like College Conductor. If you have a problem that you're trying to solve for your side business or side project, or you have thoughts about how to do it, I hope that this stream can show you some tools that you can consider when building out something yourself. And I hope that you learn something along the way. So with that, I want to encourage you to chat if you join in. I left a note there so that if you do join the chat a little bit later, you will see that I'm open to questions and happy to answer them if I can. If you come across this later on YouTube or come to a later stream at some point, please share with people on Twitter and other social media so that I can get this information out there and teach people about how to build SaaS from someone who has done this for quite a while. I guess I should give you a little bit of background about who I am so that you have some credibility about me. I have been doing web application development for the better part of 5 years or so, 5+ years, at least on Python and Django. And then I've done web application development in the past at previous works in different technology stacks. I have over a decade of experience with Python, and I think I have something that I can actually teach you. So that's kind of the preface to this stream tonight, and I think we're ready to jump into the meat. So tonight's topic is focused on integrating with a third-party service. College Conductor, being a website that cares about colleges and all of that, needs information in order to add value to the service. And I'm going to integrate with another college service that provides some of that value. The service is called Prompt, and they're doing very interesting work, but in a slightly different domain from what College Conductor is trying to solve, but it's related to colleges. You can look at this GitHub issue. This project is available on GitHub as it's under my account of MB Layman and Conductor. All of the source is freely viewable. It is under the Common Clause license, so it's mostly BSD licensed, and the only stipulation is that if you decide to go into a business of this type, that you can't copy my code. That's pretty fair, but I don't think any of you are going to have that problem. So we're looking at this particular issue tonight, which is about how to integrate with this service. And I want to outline, before we get deep into the technical stuff, of what Prompt does and what they offer, and the part where I want to integrate College Conductor with their service. It's not an official integration. I'm not a business partner with them. It's more of a taking advantage of stuff that they freely publish and sending traffic their way if that's helpful, but also providing kind of a hook for College Conductor to be able to say, hey, we offer this as well, or offer a connection to this, I should say. So Prompt, if we look quickly at the site, is all about college essays, and the entire service is about editing your essays, making them appropriate for college admissions deadlines, and all of that. It's a pretty interesting service from what I understand. I'm not a domain expert, so the person that I'm actually doing all this work for is my wife, who is an independent educational consultant. And she uses these kind of services and acts as my product manager to dictate what features would be helpful in College Conductor, because she's the primary user of this as I scale it up and make it useful for more college consultants. So this is the service that we're going to be pulling from, but I really am not going to be pulling from their writing tool, which is what their primary offering is. Really what they do is have a secondary kind of a byproduct of being an essay prompt tool. And that byproduct is tracking schools and tracking what those schools have as their essays for that academic year for registration. To give you an example, here's a list, and it clicks down to American University, and it gives you what American University expects as part of their college application of some optional essays that they have here. So what I want to do in College Conductor is use this page as reference. It's actually a big, gigantic page where all the schools are on a single page. That's a pretty useful thing because it'll make my job kind of easier. But I want to be able to link to this in smart ways. And I've taken the time to kind of look at this page in advance and make sure that I can actually do this. So the way this page works is that there are links throughout. They are anchor tag links, which if you're not super familiar with URLs, that just means that there is a hash sign in the URL that kind of internally links to the page and will take you directly to that portion of the page. And so my goal with this integration is to eventually scan this page, do a web scrape of this page to extract the information and pull out the information that is at these slugs like Babson here for Babson College, and be able to track this and add links in my own service in College Conductor for any school page on my site, have an external link that will take them to prompt and bring them right to the essay prompt section so that the college admission counselor can view the essay prompts and add that information into what they send along for their students. So that is the goal of the ultimate goal today, is to have these links to this website embedded in my school pages on College Conductor. So let's go back to the issue on GitHub and take a look at how we're going to accomplish this. So, but I guess before even I get to that, let's step back a little bit. College Conductor, how is it built? The short version is that I use the Python programming language and I use Django, which is a very large and robust web framework. It's the web framework that powers websites like Instagram. It powers my current employer, my previous employer, so I have quite a bit of experience with Django, and it's a very robust tool. It has a lot of features in it, and it can kind of do everything you need to build a web application. So everything that we're going to do is focused in the realm of Django. I think that if you are new to web application development and maybe you're not interested in Django, maybe you have read about it and are a little intimidated by its feature set, I have fairly strong opinions. I still think it's a great tool for you, but maybe you don't want to go that route. Maybe you're more interested in something like Flask, which is a much smaller framework. I think that regardless of where you are on a choice of web framework to help you do your project, that the ideas that we cover here are going to be similar across most business-oriented sites. And the core idea around that is that business-oriented sites follow a pretty common architecture in that they have a database of information and they have a set of business logic or code that displays pages to the user. You can get way more advanced or leave it at a very simplistic view, but that's sort of the premise of these things, is to root yourself in a database and build your layers of stuff on top of that. So Django is no different in that regard. It has a lot of different patterns that make that possible for how to connect your URL paths on your website to different chunks of code, Python code, that then interact with a database. And we're going to touch each of those this evening. So let's look specifically at this GitHub issue. I kind of wrote this up as like a little mini specification before this stream tonight, so that you have hopefully been able to read along as I've been chatting here. But the goals of this are down at the bottom here. As I outlined, we're going to ultimately need to do a web scrape of that page and extract every school that has been put there. And once we have that information, we can store that in a database so that we can correlate it with the schools that are in College Conductor later. But before we can even store that in a database, we have to have a place to store it in the database, which means we need to create a model, which is what Django gives as its interface into a database. So every time you want to interact with a database in Django, you create a model, and a model is a way to make an abstract view of a database table. So when you create a model, you're really saying, I want all of my records in this particular database table to have this structure of these type of columns. And I hope that will make a little bit more sense as we go along. So step one is to actually make the data model. Start from the data and then work your way up to the more layers. Once we have a model in place to work from, we can then use that model and pull records out of the database and correlate them with actual schools that I have already tracked in College Conductor's database and show a display on an authenticated school page. So we're going to put in the code probably tonight to do this, but there won't be any data there to drive it yet. So it will be, you'll see it play out in how it gets plugged into templates and plugged into views, which is the chunks of Python code that actually run business logic on the site. But there's not going to be a lot of real data driving this yet, because at some point I'm going to have to actually do an automation that will do the scraping of the data, pull out everything, and let me, as the administrator, go through that data at a later time and comb through it and make connections and increase the richness of my own database data by connecting the schools that I have with the schools that are in prompt. So that's a kind of not terribly exciting task, although I've thought about ways that we can make it more interesting by scripting stuff and trying to find connections automatically. So maybe we'll do that as an exercise on a stream to see, like, how can you accelerate kind of menial work that you'd have to do that would take an individual person a long time if they were doing it all manually, but with the power of some scripting and some little tooling, you can kind of cut down on the time. So that might be something interesting. I don't think we'll get that far this evening, especially if we limit ourselves to about an hour or so. So once that will be done, I also want to mention this integration on the home page, the landing page of College Conductor, which means this page over here, as one of the benefits that is available for admissions counselors to use. I don't know where to put it yet, so again, that might not be, we might not get that far, but the plan is to get the modeling done and hopefully the place that it gets displayed in the actual user interface, and then revisit some of the other things in the future. Okay, I think that's enough chit chat about the actual issue. Hopefully that makes sense of what the mission is, and then we'll jump into some code. Let's get started. The way Django is structured is in a series of what they call apps. So Django functions as a project, and a project is made of a collection of apps. So each of these things that you see in this directory, I'm using Vim if you're curious, but I'm just browsing through my code. Here I am, oops, one level too high. Here I am at the root of the Conductor project, and there's a lot of stuff in here. I'm not going to go through what all of these things are, but the core of it, the core of the application lives in this Conductor directory, which is a Python package where all of my Django code is living, or I should say most, without getting into too many details. But within this core directory is a number of applications. And the lingo is a little bit confusing because you might think, well, my whole thing is a web application, but it's mincing between terms, between Django versus what people think of traditionally as a web application. So you have a project, you have applications in your project. I've broken mine down so that accounts handles like users and product plans and the stuff to do a sign up. Core is kind of anything that doesn't have a good place but is kind of universally available. There's like support for doing support tickets, and there's just a bunch of stuff in here like that. But tonight we're going to focus on vendor, because that's where I want to include my third-party integrations. And I can show you some examples. Like a couple of the things that Conductor already does is export data to Google Sheets. So there's a whole section of code, not trying to read any of this right now, but there's a whole section that interfaces with Google Sheets. I have third-party stuff that does with Stripe. So my idea is to sort of funnel any of these big third-party things down into a single application, so that acts as the boundary between those services and the rest of my system. Sometimes this gets referred to as like a gateway pattern. In fact, I think I even named my things gateways to indicate that this is the sort of the wrapper that I'm putting around these actual third-party services to insulate the rest of my system from change. So let's make that a bit more concrete. Let's say that Stripe changes dramatically how customers are created, how they're connected to subscriptions, and all this sort of thing. My gateway here has a create customer interface that I put in, so that my system, when it calls in and wants to create something with Stripe, just calls create customer, passing in this little bit of information. If the details of how Stripe does that change, the rest of my system doesn't have to care. This is good abstraction principles applied, and hopefully you can see some value. So anyway, third-party services, they exist here in this vendor application, and that's where we're going to begin. If you come over down to this models file, Django, well, one more step, let's look at some of the files that are here. So Django conventionally in each application has a few files that you tend to see over and over again. You have an admin file for working with the built-in admin interface. So if you need to change anything about your data, this is where you add stuff to actually interact with that admin interface. It's something that I forgot to add to that issue, but it's totally a reasonable thing that we need to add this evening. And the other core kind of files are models, where you actually define the models that are going to be stored in your database, as well as the views. Views are the chunks of code that get exposed to users at various routes and URLs on the site. So we care about models, and you'll notice this file is totally empty. So we have to start from scratch. And rather than start completely from scratch, I'm going to start instead from a test. I'm going to do some test-driven development. If you've never done this before, we will write code that we expect to fail, with the goal of then writing the actual implementation to make the test pass. Why would you do this? So I think there's a couple of reasons. One really easy reason is that it gives you a framework for making progress. So I start by writing a test that is failing, and it's like a goal. It's a little miniature milestone that I'm trying to put in my code that says, I don't know what's going to end up way down there when I'm finally getting to the final implementation, but I know that if I take little steps along the way, I can get there. So by setting up one test after another for yourself, you can implement a lot of stuff, and it's actually a really quick way to go. So that's the primary reason why I would do it. The other reason is that you get the benefit of having a safety net of tests to rely on. So College Conductor has a a test suite that runs pretty quickly, and it gives me confidence that when I change my code, if I made a mistake or I had some expectation that some other part of my system depended on that I violated by changing some method or function, that my test should do a good enough job to say, hey, Matt, you broke this stuff over here, and you need to make sure that you don't deploy that because you might mess up other parts of your site. So as a person who is doing the side project as a one-man team, that's really important. I need as much software tooling as I can benefit from to get all the help I can need. So let's create our test. And I think because we have no code in the models directory, there's not even a test file for this. So let's create a test file. And this file is going to be called testmodels.py. Test underscore some name is the convention that Python test runners use to know that a file is meant for test. And that's how you just have to preface everything. Models then matches up with the module name of models that exist in the vendor directory. So there's kind of a parity between them. So we're in a brand new file, and I want to import. I have a test case that is kind of a helper that I use for all of my tests. I'm not using PyTest or those sort of things because Django, if you ever use it, already has its own sort of testing methodology and testing tools to help make that work. Not to say you can't use PyTest, but kind of just sticking with stock Django as much as I can. So we need to make our test case. So I call all test cases with test and then whatever I'm testing. And the thing that we're testing is a model that doesn't exist yet. But what do I want the model to be called? The data that I ultimately want to go in the model, I guess I should stop there, is a connection to the schools that I have in one part of my code and those slug identifiers that I had in another part of my code. I guess I also will need the name that prompt calls the school so that when I do the administrative work of saying, what does this identifier in prompt system map to? How am I going to make those connections? I need to be able to have all of that data so that I, as a person inspecting the code or inspecting this data, can connect the dots between my different school types. So I'm going to call this a prompt school. And it's going to inherit from test case. This is standard Python syntax, so it's a test class that inherits from test case. And let's start with the first bit that we expect the model to need. So I want my model to have that thing that goes in the URL is usually called a slug. And so that's what I'm going to call it. So I'm going to say test that it has a slug. And in the true spirit of TDD, I'm going to write something that I know is going to fail, but I'm driving towards my intention. So I want a prompt school, and I'm going to pretend that I have the tooling to make a prompt school with my testing automation. So if this part may not make any sense to you right now. That's totally okay. But we will get to a point where I hope that it does make sense. And when I create my school, I want it to have a slug. And I went to the University of Virginia as my undergrad, so I'm going to put University of Virginia as my fictitious test slug to test against. Or you know what? Let's actually create a local variable called University of Virginia. And let's change this to the variable. And what I want to assert is that the slug is equal to the prompt school slug. So I'm going to test, or go, before I run this code, I'm going to verify something else for a moment, so bear with me. I never remember. the way that I've been writing, okay. In Python testing, it's kind of ambiguous when you say assert equal, whether the first parameter to that statement is your expected data or your actual data. Some testing frameworks will tell you a very particular order of first has to be expected or first has to be actual, so that when it does the comparison, it can give more appropriate diagnostic information. Python doesn't really care. It's kind of a left-hand side, right-hand side sort of scenario. But I do like to try and be at least internally consistent within my own tests. So it looks like, judging from one of my other test files, that I'm putting my expected value as the first value. So we can go back to this and see that I did it. So did it in the right way I would expect. My expected value is slug, and the actual value is this is going to be the slug attribute from my prompt school. So let's run the test, see what happens. Boom. Okay. No surprise, it totally blew up because I made up a bunch of stuff along the way. And we're going to backfill to get these. So this prompt school factory is a pattern that I'm using from a testing tool called Factory Boy. Factory Boy's entire mission is to make it easy to make database records that get put into a test table and then get kind of wiped out between tests. So when you want to set up to have data to work with in your tests, you use these factories to make that data. And what this is telling me right now is that we don't have a factory that actually exists. So we want to go over to the conductor test case, and I'll show you why. The way that I've set up my test case is to connect all of my factories that I have into one test case. This gives me sort of a global place that I can sort of at will make whatever kind of thing that I want. And so we're going to label this as saying the next thing we want is to have our vendor app. And the thing that I want it to be called is the prompt school factory. And I'm adding this, how am I adding this? I'm adding this as class attributes onto my test case class, so that they're just accessible attributes that for anything that derives, like test prompt school, will be able to access this factory very quickly. So if I come back over here, you can see that it failed immediately because it says undefined name prompt school factory, because I don't have anything imported yet. You can notice that the rest of these factories come from imports in various locations. They all follow a similar pattern, a pattern that I'm planning to follow as well. So we're going to back up. We're just going to keep backing up until we have the thing that works. So I want from conductor, and I want my factory to live with the vendor application. And it's going to be called test factories. And we're going to import prompt school factory. Again, this thing doesn't exist yet. So now we're going to get an import error. Yeah, module not found error. That's a more specific import error that comes from Python 3. It used to be just import error, whatever. The reason it doesn't exist because that file doesn't exist yet. So now we want to come into our tests directory. And if you notice at the bottom of my my Vim window there, it says conductor vendor test. That's the directory that I'm in. So I want to create a file here, which I'm going to call factories.py. And I'm going to save it so that at least the module exists, and run our test again. And it still doesn't find it, which still makes sense. We have not created this. So the Factory Boy package exists under this name. It's not called Factory Boy. It's just called factory. So when you're making a factory class, you derive from something in factory. So we're going to make our prompt school factory, and it's from factory Django model factory. I only know that because I've done this a bunch. of times. And for now, I'm just going to say pass because I don't want to define that. I just want to see, again, test-driven development approach. This test is very fast, so and I have a quick way to run it. That's not what I anticipated because we're not in that same file anymore. So let's go back to that file and run this test, and it should still fail. Yeah. So, and we keep looking at the errors. And I'm kind of, I do this myself, but I know what all the answers are to these, but I'm walking you through a pattern, which I think will show you a way that you can learn about code by reading error messages. And I think that's a skill that's very valuable for developers. I think a lot of developers neglect to read error messages, and they cause a lot of headache for themselves. And so if you learn to actually read error messages, a lot of times error messages are trying to be helpful. There are plenty of obtuse ones as well, but they will help most of the time. So let's actually read this error message. It says cannot generate instances of abstract factory prompt school factory. And the reason is because we have not set our model. Okay, we're getting closer. So now we're going to come down here, and the way that you set the model, don't worry too much about this, is with this model attribute. And I'm going to say I want it to be prompt. The model itself is going to be prompt school, if you remember. And if I save, my editor is complaining. It says, I don't know what prompt school is. So now it's time to import the actual model. Again, stepping back, sort of a rinse and repeat. Eventually you'll get there. You'll stop complaining about things that don't exist. I think this is actually, I'll pause for a second. This is actually a good technique for if you're someone who is very intimidated by an empty file, or maybe like you're a writer and you really don't like an empty page. This is a good way to get over that initial hurdle of saying, I don't know what to write about, because the test is informing you of what you need to do next. You may forget steps along the way. Happens all the time to me. I actually use the error messages sometimes to remind me, oh yeah, I need to do that. And this is a technique that can help you do that. So we're going to say vendor models import prompt school. And now that exists, but now it doesn't really exist, right? Because if I come up here and run our test again, it says I don't know what prompt school is. So now we're getting close now. So we're going to go back to our vendor models file, and we're going to import the thing that all models derive from, which is in the Django models module. And we're going to say class of prompt school is a models model. And at this point, I'm actually going to give it some documentation to say what it will be. So this model tracks the integration with prompts essay listing page. That's really what we care about. That's what's going on. So now this test was actually starting to get really close to real failures, because if we did it right, the prompt school factory is pointing at prompt school, which is pointing at a model, and the only problem with this model right now is that it has no data on it. Okay, say we did. I goofed. I remembered the name wrong. So Django DB models, is that right? Let's check another. And I've been doing Django for 5 years and I still forget module names. Okay, yeah, DB models. So I missed one level of package, sorry. So try this again. That was a bit anticlimactic. Okay, very good. Now we're now we're cooking with gas, as they say. So our model does not have a slug field attribute. So let's look at, and I'm going to cheat a little bit, and because I have other models that have used a slug, well, I believe I do. Let's search for it, see if we can find one. Yeah. Ah, there it is. So I'm going to use, I'm going to use this version here. I'm not going to go into what this model is. Just trust me that it's another model that had one of these slugs, because slugs are a common way to reference things in URLs. So you will, if you do enough web applications that have pages like this, you will encounter slugs in your career. So I want a slug field to exist, and I want to set its max length, and I want it to be unique, hoping that the folks over at Prompt aren't reusing these slugs to refer to multiple schools. If they are, they have a real internal problem with their own data. I hope that that's just not the case. So I'm going to enforce that constraint on my own database as well. And if in a crazy scenario that this is not true, and uniqueness is not the issue, then I can fix that later. But better to kind of lock down your data model if you can. Okay, so maybe what is even the benefit? Having a unique slug, which is just a slug is just a chunk of text. It's just a string that exists in a database record. Having it unique means that when I do a query on a slug, it should guarantee either one of two states. Either I get one record back or I get 0 records back. And if I did not enforce that uniqueness, it would be possible that I could do a query for a slug and get more than one school back. And at that point, it really complicates business logic, because if you have to suddenly think about, well, the answer is it could be 0 or 1 or a collection, many things that could come back, that's more cases to consider. So that is why I'm trying to put this unique thing here to say, when I'm doing these queries, I can with confidence say that it's going to give me one thing. All right, so I think now we have enough to let our test pass. Hey, we did it. What else do I want to do with this? I also want to ensure that that when I create one of these prompt schools, so these factories are useful in context of more than just doing the data model. And one thing that happens right now, I'll just start writing the test so that we have something to talk from, is when you create one of these things, Django tries to default, or maybe a better stated, Factory Boy tries to default to the absolute minimum amount of stuff that's required of it. So if the slug field will permit to have like an empty string with no value, then it'll permit that. So, but I don't want that to be the case, because if I ever use one of these in a different test, I want that to be kind of representative of real data. And so I'm going to say, I don't want you to be an empty string. And so what's going to happen, I believe, is that this test will fail. Yeah. So there's no requirement over here that we add anything of substantial data. And what's interesting is that the uniqueness permits one record that will have an empty string. But if I actually created 2 schools like this, what we would find is that the database is going to blow up and say, like, well, wait a minute, you're asking to create another prompt school that has an empty slug, but you told us that that was supposed to be unique, so that's not allowed. but I just don't want that scenario to occur at all, where there's a slug that is an empty string. So how do we make this test pass? This is where we come in and go to our actual factory. Excuse me. Sorry about that. We go to our factory and we say we need to give it some kind of instruction for generating unique slugs for each of these instances that it creates. That's what the factory is also good for. So the factory, I haven't really gone to what does it actually do. Right now, you've just seen it be sort of an empty class. But if we go back and look at it, at that file, and let's look at a different one. Let's look at tracker, because we're probably going to want the same one that's over here. So you can use extra stuff that will generate fake data for you, so that when you create a factory instance that gets persisted into your database, it's more than just the defaults. So let's come back down here and look at our test. And now this passes, but let's see, I'm just curious, like what is Faker, which is a factory adds another package called Faker, and Faker's job, its entire reason for existing, is for generating fake data, if you couldn't tell by the name. So let's assert that the opposite, that we actually want these two things to be equal, just so we can see what the test will generate for us. So it's generating something that looks like a slug. It's, in this example, it's election 3 box. But the cool part about Faker is that it's going to generate, wow, that's really interesting coincidence, school. It's going to generate different stuff each time. So this will, it prevents you from writing code for your tests that is dependent on static data. In fact, if I was really being super good about this, I could probably use an instance of Faker right here, and rather than hard coding University of Virginia, I could actually say, Faker, give me a slug. The reason that I'm not doing that is because I kind of want my test to tell a story, to say, here is what this model data is supposed to represent, to give you an example of what it's supposed to look like. You can kind of deduce that from the model definition over in the models file, but it's not fully obvious. So that's one thing. Okay. What else do we need in here? We need, I want a name. And again, I'm gonna cheat and take it from that other models file, because it's the same stuff. Like this thing is functioning, this model here is functioning for a kind of similar function. It's got a little bit more processing involved, which I'm not going to focus too much on. But it really is for the purpose of analysis and looking at when I'm connecting the dots later, what do I need to actually make those connections? I'm going to need a name. And to connect it to what does prompt actually care. So what I want to be able to do ultimately is say, you know, this is Bernard, and let's inspect it. So there's an anchor somewhere near here. Here it is. There's an anchor of Barnard, and there's the school name right here. So actually, when I do the web scrape later on, I'm probably, you know, I think all of these follow a pretty consistent pattern, I would guess. Let's see if that's true. Yeah, so there's some code involved here, I would assume, that these people did to make this in a consistent way. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to look for all of the links that have this. And so what I want to do is I want to pull out Babson as the slug, and I want to pull out Babson College as the name. But I need to be able to store that when I do that scrape. We're going to need this. But let's continue with our test-driven development approach and leave this commented out for now. So we're going to copy this, because sometimes copying is convenient. And I'm going to do a substitution and change slug to name. And I'm going to say University of Virginia as the name. Okay. And again, if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please drop it in the chat. I'm happy to take a moment to take a break, take a breather, let your brain absorb some stuff, or clear up any confusing points for you. But because I'm so used to doing this stuff, I might steamroll you if I'm not careful. So we have this test of we need to have a name in our model. And now we have a test proving that the name is not there. So let's uncomment this. Let's try it again. Now the test passes. That's good. Similarly, with the slug story, I don't want to have empty names for my schools. So I'm going to put this in there and test it, and it should fail. Whoops. I never went back and fixed the test. Okay. So we want these to be not equal to empty strings. And it fails that because we haven't told our factory to do anything about it. So let's go back to the tracker factory, and I'm just going to copy what's here. Because again, this is following a very similar pattern as that other model. So sometimes it's okay to copy. I think our culture as software developers tell you don't repeat yourself. They kind of like hammer that in you. Dry, dry, dry. That's the acronym, don't repeat yourself, which I'm doing a million times over, so I'm really violating it at many meta levels. But dry is good a lot of the time. But I think in test code specifically, it's one of these areas where a little bit of repetition is okay, because it kind of increases the resiliency of your tests in some way. So if instead you tried to find some clever way of making the common app tracker factory and the prompt school factory be the same thing, like if you look at them and you squint, they seem like, wow, those are really similar looking things. That's deceptively so, I would say. They do have some common traits, but they are not the same thing. They fundamentally model different portions of the system. So it's a dangerous temptation to fall into some of these patterns, to think that I've got to make it so that this code only exists in one place. I think a little bit of duplication can be a useful tool. Now there's a point at which you see too much commonality, and it's an indicator that, okay, this is a pattern that is applying to all of these models, and maybe it really is truly a common thing that exists as some abstract notions that I hadn't even considered in my actual data modeling and my design. And when you get to those kind of decision points, you're actually better equipped because you've been able to step back and you've been able to inspect your system and review it and then extract that knowledge. So the model is actually emerging out of observation from the code. This is in contrast with a point of view where you are proactively trying to design something into the model. And the difference is what you might produce from trying to design something versus observing emergent behavior is that one might not be the right fit. The thing you designed, because remember, you know as little about your system now compared to what happens in the future. So, I know way more about College Conductor and this domain of college admissions today than I did when I started a couple of years ago. Vastly more. So the decisions I can make about things are much more intelligent. So similarly, if you follow that sort of philosophy with your design and kind of let things settle, let things stew, and you will eventually see patterns. So that just means you have to be a little comfortable with some duplication sometimes. Okay, enough of my soapbox. So we test all of our tests in this file, and all 3 pass. Great. There is another thing that is missing from this model, and it's sort of the key thing, because let's go back to the actual issue. Let's remind ourselves, well, what are we trying to solve? We're storing this prompt school data, but the real thing that we want to do is we want to be able to display the link to the school page. I guess I forgot to say, what is this school page? So let's look at one. I'm not logged in, but you'll get an idea. So we're at the actual College Conductor site, and this is the unauthenticated page, which is kind of a teaser page, which is meant to give you a little bit of information about the school, and then kind of fade out and say like, oh, do you want more? Sign up and you'll get more. So this doesn't display the whole thing, but what I want to have is when you're on the other side of the fence, when you're actually a member that's paying for the service, I want the prompt information to show up in this school's profile. That's where this is going to live. I'm sorry I didn't start with that. That's kind of a silly thing to get nearly an hour in and just now be showing you what is this actually functioning for. But this is the basic page that's going to exist. And I want to have a very rich profile of information for college admissions counselors to work from, pulling from various services like government websites. That's what this college navigator thing is, or the actual school's website, and any of this truly like relevant data that they need to actually do their job. So that's what we're going for. So I say all that because when we come back over here, what we finally need in this is a connection to a school itself. And so the way that you do that is with a foreign key. Foreign keys are a database terminology thing that means it's a way of defining a relationship. So if you think about database tables, when you think of it, you think of them kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. They're things that have rows, and each row in a database is considered a record. And the columns, just like in your Excel spreadsheet, there's an entry for each record in the column. I'm still bad at this streaming thing a little bit, so if I'm doing this the wrong way, I think it's, opposite. Sorry. So you're working from this mental model of I have a table of data and information about records. If I need to link to another bit of information in my database, that exists in a separate table. And sticking with the Excel metaphor, that means it exists in another spreadsheet. The Excel metaphor is not great in a lot of ultimate ways, but at a minimal notion, it can give you an idea. So if I have my prompt schools in one spreadsheet, they're all numbered, starting at 1, going down to however many. I have a separate table, a separate spreadsheet that's also numbered, starting at 1, going through whatever. That is a list of my schools. And so I want to be able to make a connection that says that the prompt school record is able to point over to the school record. The way you do that is with a foreign key, and you can kind of see the name maybe a little bit. It's foreign, and that's a different table, and it's a key because it's the identifier that lets you find the record in the other table. So my prompt school is going to have a column called school, and it will just have a number in it. It's going to be what's considered the primary key, and primary key of 42 would then go over to the school table and look for record 42, and pull that out, and those two things would be associated. So that's what foreign keys do, and that's what we need. So let's again cheat a little bit, because I know this is another thing that's available in this guy. And I'm going to let's write our test first. How about that? So we want to test that it has a school. This time we want, and here's where the factories start to become powerful, because I can very quickly say give me a school by using the school factory create method. And I can create a prompt school and change the guts of this to say the school is equal to school, and then assert, just like with the slug, I can assert that the school is equal. Okay, so that's sort of the data contract that says here's what your school can have a reference to. And if we run this, it's going to say I don't know what you're talking about. School is not a valid keyword argument for this. It's not a part of the model, so let's make it part of the model. The definition of this is there's a few parts to this, and let's go over each part. So my model that I'm working from, the core application that I started with on College Conductor, is a planner. The whole purpose of the thing is to make a plan for your students and to have a set of deadlines and all this stuff, and it's generating plans. So that's the name of the application that I started with. And so that's why the school model itself lives in the planner application. So this is the naming that you put in here to reference a foreign key. So that's the data table that we care about. So Django is going to do the translation, say like, what database table are you referring to? The next attribute, null equal true. This means that in my prompt model table, I don't have to have a connection to the school table. And this is an important quality, because when I do my initial web scrape, there's no way that the web scrape is going to be able to connect the dots to the actual schools. I could do a pretty close approximation, but it would still ultimately fail the test to be able to map to every school I have, because there could be any number of reasons for this. Maybe the set of schools that I'm tracking, which is over 2,000, but maybe that set of schools doesn't have one of the schools that's mentioned in prompt. That's one scenario. Maybe the naming that I have in my table of actual schools just doesn't match the naming, so I can't like automatically connect the dots. So there's a lot of reasons why I can't automatically make a connection to school. So we have to start, and the database has to have a value there. So we have to permit it to let it store null, which is just the absence of data. Blank equal true just means that in the administrative side, which I can show you a little later, it will permit values to be null without raising a problem. If you didn't have this, then every time you'd go into the admin console area and you tried to save something, if you didn't give it a school, it would complain and say like, hey, wait a minute, this is null right now, but you need to really give it a value. And then something that came into Django in the last couple of years is you have to tell it what happens when you delete something. So this on delete is actually referring to the thing that we're pointing at. So it's saying, what is this? This is trying to say when a school is deleted, what should be the effect on this prompt school record? It's a little confusing. And what on delete is saying right here with set null means like if, let's go back to our example of 42. If you were pointing at school 42, and at some point down in the future, I deleted school 42, the database wants to be consistent. It doesn't want to point to a school that no longer exists. And in order to satisfy the database in that way, you have to do one of a few things. You can either say set it null, which means like take the 42 that was in the prompt school and set it back to being nothing, empty, which is what I plan to do here. That's what set null is doing. There's another option that says cascade. Cascade says like, if I delete a school over here, I also want it to like have a ripple effect. I want it to cascade and delete the prompt school over here. And I don't want to do that in this case because it's sort of a it's destructive operation, and it can spread out in ways that you don't anticipate. But that's what it does. Why would you want to do that? Let's imagine that we are a blog site that has a user sign-up page, and let's say we really care about the user privacy and their right to their content, yada yada yada, GDPR, I don't know. But let's say the user decides to close their account on the blog site and they want to delete all of their records. If you have a cascade set, you could have a relationship where you could have a comments model and a user model, and if the user model is a foreign key on comments that has the cascade, if the user deletes their record, then it will cascade out to their comments and also delete the comments. Hopefully that illustrates a bit of what that's for. So that's what the parameters on this foreign key thing are for. I wanted to have all of those. So this test should now pass because it can have a school, but I also want in my factory, in the default case, I want to recognize that I want the default prompt school to actually be intentionally empty here. So I'm going to assert that that the prompt school is none, which is to say it's null in the database. And that should also be true. Okay. Where are we now? I think that I've put all the information that I care about into tracking. This information, the name and the slug. So the slug is going to be what I ultimately link to when I'm linking in the school profile. That's important. The name is to help me on the back end connect slugs to schools in my own database. So I also need to have this connection so that when I display a page, like we did over here, the University of Virginia, so when it pulls the University of Virginia page, it will also be able to pull the prompt school record if one exists and display that link as appropriate. So I think that's the three kind of critical pieces of information. That leaves us with these files that are new and modified. And so let's use Git. That's my version control tool to add them to version control and then go ahead and commit them. And so I like to review the commit sometimes just to make sure that I didn't leave any like print statements or comments that I meant to come back to. You'd be surprised at how often you forget, especially when you start working across many files at once, things that you wanted to come back to and then just never did. So I modified my test case file to connect the test case to this prompt school. We created the model in the models file, which is the appropriate place for it to live. We have our factory file, which actually creates the prompt school factory and lets it have some attributes. That's all good stuff. And then we have our actual model test that tests the data contract that we've laid out in the model, everything that we care about. There's still another bit of information here that we're missing, and that is migration. So in Django, in any web application actually, you want to avoid taking down your website in order to make an update, and in order to make changes. You want to automate as much as possible the ability to make data changes. So Django has a set of tools called migrations, and migrations are designed to look at the models that you've created and generate the proper database SQL statements to create new tables, to add new columns, to delete tables, etc., etc. But in order to do that, you have to generate a migration file. And it won't do that automatically for you because it doesn't know the checkpoint of when you want to do that. So now that I'm happy with my model that we did, what I want to do is I want to tell Django, using this manage.py management utility that we have, that I want to make a migration. So I also realized something else that we neglected. So we can run this command of make migrations, and we want to run it on the vendor application. This is the first model that was ever added to this application, so it's calling it 0001 initial. And let's take a look at that file just so we can see what is in there. Let's close some of these other things so you can actually see it. So it's telling us what the previous migration that it thinks it had kind of reference, because we are referencing a school foreign key, so it needs to be able to draw a connection to say, like, here was when the database I'm phrasing that all wrong. We have to point to the school model that's in the Planner application, and there have been a lot of migrations in the Planner application to get to the data model state of today. And here's what this migration has to come after, so it's consistent. The reason that's done is so if you were to start up my code and run through your own database and run all the migrations so that we match on the stuff that I have and the stuff that you have, it has to get that sequencing right. That's what that line is. And then here's all the fields that are there. Name, school, and slug should look very familiar because that's what's in the model. Django by default, I told you that there are keys, and it will create a key automatically for you, which it defaults to calling ID. So that's what goes into a migration. So now let's get to the piece that I forgot. And that piece is an admin piece. So if, again, I'm going to borrow from over here because that's just a quick way to go about it. The admin is the tools that you have to work with your data through a user interface so that you don't have to mess around with a database from a console. It's a very convenient, useful tool, and it's a very powerful feature that Django has that a lot of other web frameworks do not have out of the box. And I will show it to you once we actually get one created. So what you have to do with the admin is tell it the pieces that you care about for displaying. So we want to import our prompt school model, and then when we want to declare an admin interface that can be used to show off that model. So let's put prompt school here, and we'll call it the prompt school admin, and it is an admin model admin. Okay, and our list display is going to be, we'll just use the same thing that's down below of the name. Okay, so let's try this out, shall we? First thing we want to do is we have our model, but I have a local database that's installed on my Mac that has my database tables for this project available that I can just kind of play with. So the first thing we need to do to actually make this workable is run the migrate command. Migrate is going to look through every application in the project and look at all of those migration folders and try to find any new files that represent things that should be run. And so if we run that command, you can see it looked in all of those apps that we saw plus some other ones that come from Django itself. And it found that the 001 initial thing from vendor was a migration that had not been executed yet, which makes sense because it's brand new. So now what we can do is go start up a local web server. And we're going to open it. Whoops. Let's do this differently. Sorry about this. My browser is used to calling this localhost, and it has an exception for localhost, but not 127.0.0.1. So if I log in with my dummy credentials on this local thing and come over here, I can view my administrative site. And so this is showing me all of the models that I have. If we go to the bottom, look, it's our new model. And there's nothing here yet. So let's pretend that that we have that web scraping stuff going. And the web scraper went through and it found one school. And sticking with our example, we're going to say University of Virginia, and slug is University of Virginia. And this is, so Django is pretty smart about foreign keys, and it can do a lookup of all the schools. This is probably kind of slow. Like, it had to load every school in my local database to do that. So we might want to make the admin smarter about something in a second, but this will work for now, just to demonstrate. So let's save that. And a second, Django's not slow. What's really happening is a slow handshake with the local TLS certificate that I'm doing with Firefox. So even though that seemed like a really slow reaction, that wasn't really Django's fault. That was my local browser configuration. So don't worry too much about that. So here's the name. And so now we know that we have one prompt school. I'm kind of deciding if I should show, I probably should show which one of these are like empty. So let's go back to our admin. This is where we kind of are tweaking the UI, the user interface of the admin. So I think what I want to do is I want to display the school as well. And now that we've done that, if I refresh this page, again, wait for the local TLS. If you look in the bottom corner, you can see the TLS handshake is taking forever. So now it's displaying the school as well. All right, so let's walk through another hypothetical scenario of adding one of these schools, and this time I'm going to do it without adding the school foreign key. So let's pretend that I don't have Babson College in my local database. So I think that's what prompt called it when we looked at that earlier. And I'm going to save it without actually changing the school. If I had left blank equal false, or the default, that save right there would have failed. It would have come back with a red error message and said, highlighted school, and said, you can't leave this page without saving that. So here's something useful. So when I actually come through this as an administrator later on and when this whole process is done, I've connected everything everywhere, but then have to go through the process of enriching my data by connecting it to my schools, here's what I'm going to want to see. I'm going to want to find these pages that have empty schools and then go fill them in and actually connect them. So that's useful. So that's one display change that has made this admin page more useful. The other thing that I want to do is on the individual page, I don't want to load every school. And I think, hopefully I haven't made one of the admins. Sorry, I guess I don't. Okay, well, let's go to the Django documentation for a minute. The other thing I want to do is like essentially on that individual page, rather than having a drop down that shows every school, I just want it to be a number field that I can do a lookup of all the schools. And that'll make more sense in a minute because we want to find the Django admin, and I can't remember the attribute name exactly, so that's what I'm looking for. I'm trying to find something like raw ID fields. There it is. And the raw ID fields does, well, it'll be easier to show it. Just know that that's what we're going to set right now. We're going to go back to our admin and come down here and change this to raw ID fields, and I'm going to use school as one of those fields. Okay. So if we return to the admin again, and this time click on University of Virginia, there's a couple things that will happen differently. This time around, it's not going to load. It shouldn't load. Why did I do that? Maybe I used the wrong name. Sorry, I'm just reading a little bit to make sure I understand the documentation. Well, it should have been it. Maybe it was before it finished loading. Huh. Well, I'm doing something wrong, but that's okay. The raw ID fields attribute would change this dropdown of all of this stuff into just a number, and at the side would be a selector, a little, I don't remember if it's like a little looking glass, magnifying glass or something like that. But you click it and it expands a pop-up, and you can do a search for whatever thing you care about, and then it will drop that foreign key in there, and that's how you save it. It's a way to make your administrative interface more performant and go a lot faster, but it's not quite working for me here, and I'm not going to take the time to do that. Looking at the time, I think we've reached a good point to wrap up for the evening. So we got as far. This is taking longer than I anticipated, but that's okay. We got as far as making the model for our school, and in the next stream, when we get around to it, we will come back in and actually use this data and add it to the school page, and then we can do the fun work of like doing the web scraping to actually collect this data and start going through that whole process of completing this. I really took a cue from earlier streams to actually go through and take a feature from start to finish, and not just show a part like this and then wrap it all up myself, because I want to show the complete picture of everything that has to go on to make a feature come together. So that's what I'll do. So to close it out, this whole recording will end up on YouTube as something you can reference back to get some ideas about how to work with models and how to do some tests. And I post it pretty quickly. It should be available in the next day or two. I got to do a little bit of editing to trim off some junk at the beginning and the end, but it should be up as soon as I can. And I think the next stream that I will do will be in a couple Wednesdays from now. I run my local Python meetup in my town, and it meets next Wednesday, so I can't meet next Wednesday, but I'll meet the following Wednesday, which is probably like the 19th or so, if I have my date math right. If you found this stream useful and you stuck through this long and are checking out information, if you do me a favor and share on Twitter, social media, or ask me questions on Twitter, I would be happy to answer those offline too. I appreciate the conversation that can happen sometimes. It's been a little quiet today, but that's okay. And just want to be able to teach as much as possible and offer as much as I can. And having a conversation makes that easier to do. So thank you for watching this evening, and I hope you take care. Good night.